Hi everyone, welcome to my garden. My name is Alena and we're on the Highway 150 just inland from Carpinteria. This is a space where it's a little wild and crazy. My partner and I live here, and so this is partly our food garden, and then we grow a lot of medicinal plants that we use for tinctures and teas and herbal products. So this is a very dense, wild and crazy garden. We've interplanted a lot of food plants like the corn and raspberries and squash and beets with a lot of the medicinal plants that we use in our tinctures and our formulas. And I'm going to talk about 8 or 10 really easy to grow medicinal plants today. And we're also going to talk about how to prepare them and how to use them as medicine. We're really fortunate that medicinal herbs are really easy to grow. They're a lot easier in my experience to grow than food plants, which need usually richer soil and a lot more water. So medicinal plants do really well in lots of different kinds of soil conditions, and they do really well with a really limited amount of water. And I've found over the years that the more challenges you throw at medicinal plants, the stronger the medicine. And that's because a lot of the plant chemicals that are medicinal in our bodies are actually reactions or compensations to stresses in a plant's environment, whether that's poor soil, limited or intermittent watering, insect and bird and gopher predation. All of these challenges actually allow the plants to experience a certain amount of hardship and recover from it with the help of their chemistry, which is also what helps our bodies. So herbalism it's a lifetime of learning. My background is in farming. I've been an organic farmer for actually more than a decade now, and I started out mostly growing flowers and vegetables and fruit, and got really interested in growing medicinal herbs in the last 5 years because of an internship that I did on a medicinal herb farm. And so my background is in growing these plants and having teachers and books and working with the plants as my teachers. I'm not by any means a clinical herbalist. It's not my level of experience. My experience is more on a home scale of growing these plants and using them personally. All the plants that I'm going to talk about today are really safe to use. None of them can you use too much of. They all work well if you're on like over-the-counter medication or prescription medication. Nothing that I'm talking about today has a contraindication, which means that you can use pharmaceutical medicine and you can use plants, which just offers up a lot of greater possibility for you. Herbs, especially the herbs that I'm going to talk about today, the more consistently you can use them, the better they work. So herbs work really well as tonic medicine, which means if you're able to take them once a day, over time, the effects of the plants will become stronger and more effective in your body. So to begin with, planting a medicine garden, as you can see in this garden, we've really interplanted, and you can totally do that in your own homescape. So if you have any kind of existing garden or a veggie garden, it's very easy to just tuck medicinal herbs into an existing landscape. Like I said, they don't need a lot of pampering, and so it's very easy to just tuck them into an empty space in your garden. If you're starting from scratch, I was going to talk a little bit about how we built the soil in this garden, mainly with compost. So this garden, when we started, we're in the oaks, which are really heavy clay. So when we started this garden, we were literally pickaxing into what felt like concrete. And it was pretty alarming to me. It's like, how is anything going to grow here? But we have really benefited from consistently applying compost, using drip irrigation, and using mulch. So I'm going to talk about 8 or 10 plants that I really recommend growing in your garden. And these are plants, they're all annual, which means that mostly you replant them every year, although a lot of them will come back on their own if you let them go to seed. And these are all plants that are really easy to grow. They don't need any sort of special care. And they all have a number of uses. So I tried to think of plants from which, if you just grew these 8 or 10 species, you would have a pretty robust home apothecary that could treat a lot of different issues. If I could only grow two medicinal plants in my garden, I would grow calendula and tulsi, or holy basil. So this is calendula, which is also called pot marigold. There's orange, yellow, and then this kind of yellowy orange. Medicine in calendula is in the sticky resin in the flower buds, and so it's actually really important that you plant a kind of calendula that is specifically resinous and medicinal. The two kinds that I find to be the strongest acting are a variety that's called resina for resin, and then Erfurter. I think originally calendula is from Europe and Erfurter is a Germanic name. The seed are these little kind of half moons, so these flowers are a lot smaller. They're the summer-sized flowers, and in the cooler months, they'll get this big. Calendula can do fine without irrigation if you only want to grow it in the spring. The winter rains will help it to establish, and then you'll be able to harvest without any further irrigation. You can also keep calendula going through the summer if you make sure to plant it where it will get water through the summer, and if you continue to harvest the flowers, that will encourage more blooming. So the medicinal part of calendula is the flower, and you can literally just snap them off the plant, and this flower is what you use as medicine. And they should feel sticky, and they should have a really strong, almost bitter smell. One of my favorite words in herbalism is organoleptic, which is this fancy word that means your senses can tell you whether a plant is strong medicine. So if it feels really sticky, if it has a strong smell, if it has a strong taste, you know that it is fresh and the chemistry is very active, and it's a good plant to use as medicine. Calendula blossoms are amazing for a lot of different things. The main ways are you can use them topically on your skin, and they're really good at wound healing. They have chemicals that allow cellular or promote cellular regeneration, so it's a really good plant to have for first aid. The other main use for calendula is for your immune system. It's a lymphatic herb. Your lymph system runs throughout your body and is parallel to your circulatory system, and it's how your body pushes any sort of pathogen or infection out of your blood. And the lymphatic system is really important for your immune system for that reason, that it allows your body to release and flush out toxins. And calendula is really supportive of that lymphatic movement. So it's a really good plant to make a tea out of if you're starting to feel a little under the weather. It's also a really good digestive herb. So if you have any sort of stomach troubles, this is a plant that I would use as a tea. So calendula is an amazing first aid plant, and it's a really good immune supporting plant, and it's so easy to grow, so it should be in everyone's garden. The other plant that I could not live without is tulsi. It's also called holy basil, and it's originally from India, but it does really well in this climate. Tulsi loves the heat and is super tough. It does well in the fog and in cooler temperatures as well. So even though it's originally from India, it seems to do really well essentially until frost. This is another annual plant, so you do need to replant it every year, or you can allow it to go to seed. These are the flowers, and the seeds are starting to develop further down the flower spike. And if you simply don't harvest any tulsi after a certain point, it will replant itself. Tulsi is a plant that's called an adaptogen, and that's a kind of plant that helps your body to respond to stress more effectively. So stress affects us all physically. It can be headaches for people, it can be tightness in your body, it can be indigestion, it can be having trouble with negative thoughts. It can manifest in a lot of different ways. And Tulsi is a plant that is really helpful for stress and anxiety in the moment where you're feeling it. But it's also a plant that can change how your body is triggered by stress in the first place. That's the definition of an adaptogen. It's a certain kinds of medicinal plants that just shift how your body's adrenal system and your hormones and your fight or flight response respond to stress in the first place. Tulsi is a plant that is really easy to grow. You can grow it in a pot outside your front door. And if you drink a fresh tea of this every day, it's really delicious and it's really calming. And it's a plant where the more that you take it, the more effective it is and will really help to change how your body responds to stress. So I just can't say enough about Tulsi. I really, really recommend it. Bees really love it. It's also a really delicious herbal vinegar, and this is the plant that we're going to make an herbal vinegar out of today, and I'll show you how I harvest it, because this is a plant where you use the flowers and the leaves, and the more that you cut or prune the Tulsi, the more it will grow. So another plant that falls into kind of my first aid category along with calendula is yarrow. Yarrow is native to here, the white flowered variety, Achillea millefolium. Like calendula, this is a plant where there are also cultivars that are all different colors. I've seen red, pink, yellow yarrow. The medicinal one is the white native yarrow. This is a plant that is actually perennial, so it will come back year after year once you've planted it, and it spreads really easily. It's really hardy since it's a native plant. It can do with very little water, very poor soil. And for medicine, you use the flowers and the leaves. I usually don't use the stems when I'm making medicine from yarrow. So one of the most important parts of this plant is that it can stop bleeding really quickly. So this is a really good first aid plant, and one also to recognize if you're out in the woods or hiking or camping. This is a really amazing first aid plant. You can use the leaves and the flowers as a poultice, which means that you grind them up either by chewing or with a mortar and pestle, and once you've made kind of an herbal paste, you can put that onto even a pretty deep, really freshly bleeding cut, and it will stop the bleeding really quickly. It's also very antibacterial and antiviral. So this is another plant along with calendula that I would include in an infused oil to make as a salve for wound healing. And also because of those properties, it's another really immune supportive herb. So the tea has a pretty strong taste, but it is very warming, which is a way that your body helps to fight infections. Yarrow is an amazing, easy to grow plant. Beneficial pollinators love yarrow. It's always covered in pollinators. And it's also a really good plant to interplant in a vegetable garden or in a more formal landscape, because it attracts beneficial insects that are actually predators on a lot of really common insect pests in our gardens. So it's a plant that can help to just increase the overall health of an organic garden by attracting the right kinds of bugs into our garden. Yarrow is one of the plants that we actually don't grow on irrigation in this garden. On irrigation is our food and a lot of the medicinal plants, and then all around the garden off irrigation are native plants that we've planted to be able to use their medicine from our garden. Yarrow is one of those plants. White sage is another. Hummingbird sage, stinging nettles, and wild rose are the main ones that we use for medicine. And so we have them growing here so that we don't have to go into wild spaces and collect them. Yarrow is also just very beautiful as a cut flower. The final first aid plant that I feel that everyone should have in their garden is comfrey. I will say that comfrey can take over in your garden, so you should be really intentional about where you plant it. It's really hardy and can propagate itself from even the tiniest root chunk. So I've thought many times that I've completely removed comfrey from a space in our garden, and it will be back within a few weeks. So once you have it, you can never not have it, so plant accordingly. The medicinal part of comfrey are the leaves and the roots. The leaves of comfrey are another plant that is used topically as a poultice or infused into an oil. This is a plant that's also called knit bone, and it's really good for pretty traumatic internal injuries, torn ligaments, broken bones, dislocated joints, any sort of kind of intense musculoskeletal issue. Comfrey is really good at healing. If you use it externally as an oil, you can apply that to a broken or torn part of your body from the outside, and it can still heal the inside of your body. I would caution you, this is not a plant that you should use on a really deep but surface cut, because it can actually heal the surface of your skin so quickly that your body won't be able to heal itself from the inside out. So calendula and yarrow are both really great, safe plants to use for deep surface cuts. I would not use comfrey for that. I wouldn't use comfrey on broken skin. It's more for a broken bone or a torn ligament internally. So it has a pretty specific purpose, but it does its purpose very well and better than most other medicinal plants, which is why I would include this plant in my medicine garden. It maybe has a fewer diversity of uses than the other plants I'm talking about, but it's very useful. Another plant that I could not live without in my medicine garden is mint. Mint is really easy to grow. It can also be pretty invasive, so plan accordingly if you're incorporating it into your garden. I've found that I use as much mint as appears, so it's not a problem for me personally, but it is a plant that you kind of need to set a perimeter around if you don't want it to be everywhere. Of the plants I'm talking about, mint is who would most prefer to have more water. Mint does okay in our garden with limited irrigation, but it definitely does a lot better once the rains come. So mint is, the medicine is in the leaves and in the flowers, and this is one of the best plants for digestion, as a tea specifically. So a really strong herbal infusion of mint. This is peppermint, there's also spearmint, chocolate mint, there's a lot of different kinds of mint, and they can be used interchangeably. This is a really great tea for soothing irritated digestive tissues. So if you have an upset stomach, mint tea will really help. Mint is also really connected to helping your brain feel more calm, and I think that's partly because your gut and your brain are really connected to one another, and a lot of times kind of mental like sadness or depression is often linked to indigestion. And so being able to help your stomach can also help your mind. And mint is also considered a nervine, which is a kind of plant that is just really calming and soothing to your nervous system. So this is an amazing after dinner tea or an early morning tea because it is a little bit stimulating because of the taste. Another plant that has a lot of uses similar to mint is lemon balm. It has a really strong lemon fragrance. It's really sweet tasting. It's a really delicious tea or herbal infusion, and this is also one of my favorite plants to make herbal vinegars with because it's really tasty. So lemon balm is also really cooling. Again, it's really good for your stomach, and it's also really connected to soothing and easing your nervous system. So this is a really good plant to use for anxiety, acute stress, depression. It's also a really good plant to use for kids specifically because they really love the taste. And so it's a plant that I use a lot with my 8-year-old niece she can get really wound up by big exciting days. And so this is either as a tea or as a vinegar tincture at night. This can really help to slow your body down and get you ready for sleep. So it's not a plant that will sedate you in any way or put you to sleep. It just helps your body to relax enough that you can sleep. This is kind of perennial. The same plant will stick around for 2 or 3 years. So if you want to have it always in your garden, I would plant a new plant every 2 or 3 years. This is another plant like Tulsi that the more you harvest it during the growing season, the more it will grow. So it slows down in the winter and mostly goes dormant and is just above the ground. But in the growing season, we probably harvest lemon balm 5 or 6 times. So it's really productive. Even just one plant will give you enough tea to last you for the whole year. And you can dry it to have it in the winter as well. Brain and belly herb is chamomile, which a lot of you probably know. It's the classic sleepy time tea. I feel like a lot of people's grandmothers gave them chamomile tea when they were little. And it's a really beautiful flower. The medicine is in the flowers. This is a plant where we don't use the foliage to make medicine. It's only the flowers. And just like calendula, they'll pop right off, and the more you harvest, just like the rest of these plants, the more they will bloom. Chamomile prefers cooler weather like calendula, so most of our chamomile and calendula harvesting is in the spring and in the fall. Once the temperatures stay a little cooler, it tends to go dormant in the summer with the higher temperatures. The flowers are used as a tea. They're again really connected to cooling and soothing digestive tissues. And the more that you can take plants to help your body fully digest and get nutrition from your food, the more that you'll be able to support your nervous system and your immune system, which is why I focus a lot on herbs that are connected to both brain and belly. Chamomile is also an amazing brain herb. It's another really good plant to take at night to help your body relax so that you can sleep. And it's also a plant that will help with anxiety in the moment. And this is another plant where it is annual, so it will die back once it gets cold. But if you allow these flowers to go to seed, it will plant itself everywhere. So most of these plants will do that. You kind of just have to plant them once and let them go to seed, and they will come back over and over again. I'm a huge advocate of keeping your garden kind of messy so that things are allowed to go to seed and finish their life cycles, and the chaos kind of provides more of welcome home and hiding place for bugs and birds, and your garden gets a lot more diverse the messier you allow it to be. One of the most classic immune supporting herbs is echinacea. So this is echinacea flower. The root and the seeds are also medicinal. So in any sort of treatment with echinacea, I would use all 3 parts of the plant: the root, flower, and seed. Echinacea you can plant in either the fall, so that it has all of the winter rains to establish, or in the spring. And you're able to harvest the first fall after you plant. You're able to harvest the root and the seeds. And all during the summer you can harvest the flowers. It usually starts blossoming in August. And this is another plant that is actually perennial, so it will come back year after year, and it's very easy to propagate either from seed, or my favorite thing to do is to dig up echinacea plants in the fall, harvest the root for medicine, and keep the crown, so the top inch of root, with also the growing point of the leaves, and replant those crowns as soon as you've harvested the root. So this is a plant where you can harvest its root for medicine and then replant it, and it will continue to grow, which is really amazing. And echinacea is just a very classic immune supporting herb. The root, if you eat it fresh, is very tingly. It's almost numbing, which is again that idea of organoleptic, like your senses can tell you that there's strong medicine in this plant because it can turn your mouth numb. And it's really stimulating to your blood and to your white blood cells, which is why it's so effective as an immune supporting herb. So especially getting into the fall, this is a plant that it's really useful to have access to as a tea or as a tincture, because you can start to proactively take echinacea, and also elderberry is another plant I would use that way, to be proactive in keeping yourself healthy in a time where a lot of us can get colds. This is also important as we move into our first winter with coronavirus, to just be sure that we're really keeping our bodies as healthy as they can be, really supporting our immune system, trying to eat as many fresh fruits and vegetables and leafy greens as we can, because herbalism works really well as a proactive, preventative medicine. So it's another really beautiful flower in your garden as well, echinacea. So the last plant in my basket is California poppy, which you all know as a wildflower. California poppy is most important as a sleep medicine. So it's one of the most effective herbal sleep aids that we have. And it's really special also because some herbs that people take to promote sleep will make you feel a little groggy. It can be a little harder to wake up in the morning. And California poppy usually doesn't have that effect. The root and leaves and flowers, we usually make a tincture with them. So you could make either a vinegar or alcohol-based infusion. And if you are able to take that tincture about half an hour to an hour before you'd like to be sleeping, it should really help. Even in pretty chronic insomnia, people can find a lot of relief with California poppy. And as anyone who's experienced insomnia knows, having healthy, restful sleep is just so important for your body, for your immune system, for your mental health, for your digestion. So this is a really, really lovely and special and important herbal medicine, mostly for sleep. And the root, when you dig it, again in the fall, usually root harvests you do in the fall once the above ground foliage has died back and the growing power has returned to the root. When you cut the roots open, they're bright orange, just like the flowers. It's really, really amazing. They're really beautiful. And the last plant that I wanted to talk about that I didn't harvest because they've gone dormant, stinging nettle, if I can convince you to grow it in your garden, is an amazing plant to have around for a number of reasons. You do have to be careful because they really sting. We grow two kinds of stinging nettle, a kind that is native to right here, and then a European stinging nettle that's a little smaller. Stinging nettle is also really easy to grow. You can take tip cuttings, so if you're able to find nettles along a creek near you, you can cut the top 4 inches of the growth point of a stinging nettle. Not this time of year, this is in the spring when they're really green and vigorous, fresh growth, and strip all but the top 2 leaves of that cutting and stick them into potting soil and keep the soil kind of damp. And they'll root really easily. I think of anything I've ever tried to root this way, stinging nettle is by far the most effective. I think like 95% effective. So it's a really easy medicine to bring into your garden. It's an amazing tea or the base for soups and stocks because it's one of the most nutrient-rich plants that you can eat. So don't eat them raw, they'll sting you. But if you're able to either blanch them and eat them as a cooked green, or pour boiling water over them to make tea or simmer as a stock, they won't sting you anymore, and instead you just get this really, really nutrient dense, full of vitamins and minerals broth that is really good for your bones and for your blood. Like I said, it is also a good allergy remedy, and it's a really immune supportive herb because it's making your body healthier with the addition of those vitamins and minerals. There's also a pretty traditional method where I grew up in the South, where there's also stinging nettle. Old timers will use the stinging leaves on arthritic joints because it's anti-inflammatory. Believe it or not, the histamine response that your body reacts with to the sting is actually anti-inflammatory, and so it's really relieving for arthritis. So it's a really awesome folk remedy for that reason. It does hurt. And I'm really sensitive to them, so I can feel them for like 2 days after I've touched them. So I would really recommend stinging nettle if you're feeling brave. You want to harvest most of the plants that I'm talking about, the leaves and the flowers, when it starts to get a little warmer. So we usually try to wait until mid-morning, early afternoon to do chamomile, calendula, yarrow, tulsi, lemon balm or mint harvests, and that's because the growing heat of the day brings a lot of the essential oils to the surface of the plants, and so they're a lot more aromatic, which again is that organoleptic clue that the medicine is really strong right then because of the warmer temperatures. Bees obviously love Tulsi, they're all around, so I always apologize to the honeybees and tell them that the more I cut it, the more it will grow, which is also true of chamomile, calendula, mint, and lemon balm. So these are all plants, like a lot of native plants, that the more you prune them, the more vigorously they'll grow. So Tulsi, lemon balm, mint, we harvest all of those plants probably once every 3 weeks to a month during the height of the growing season. And they come back in no time. So we probably get like 5 or 6 harvests per growing season until these plants start to really slow down when it gets really cold. So for a lot of the leaf harvests that I talked about, specifically the Tulsi, lemon balm, and mint, you want to, when you cut, it's best to use clippers or a really sharp knife. Either works fine. You don't really want to just tear with your hands because it's better for the plants to make a clean cut. It's less stressful to them. And all of these plants will grow back from their base, so you can cut back quite sharply. I usually cut back about 3/4 of the plant using my clippers. Just grabbing handfuls and cutting. And what that leaves is this basal clump of foliage with many, many new growth points. So each of these kind of fresh, small shoots, once the plant has been trimmed, will grow really, really rapidly. So this is our drying shed, which is our greenhouse that we cover with a tarp. You can use any of the herbs that I've talked about fresh. It's really simple and straightforward to make a fresh tea or a fresh tincture, and I'll show y'all how to do that. Another option is to dry herbs, and the appeal of doing that is that you can store them and have them through the winter once the plants are no longer in your garden. So I think if you want to have access to medicine year-round, being able to dry some of your harvest is really, really important. So the most important thing to know when drying herbs is that they should be fully protected from exposure to sunlight. So although we want to harvest our herbs while it's sunny and bright and warm, because that brings the medicine to the surface, once they're harvested, the sunlight can actually degrade the medicine in the leaves and flowers. So it's really, really important to make sure that you're drying herbs in as near total darkness as you can. So this is our greenhouse, which is covered in plastic during the spring, and then we cover it with really thick light blocking tarps in the summer so that it's totally dark in there. We have ventilation, so we have a door on one side and a window on the other. Usually there's a fan running in here when it gets really hot so that there's also good airflow. So if you have a warm, dark room in your house, that's a great place to dry herbs, sometimes like a laundry room or a crawl space or a stuffy attic. In the winter, while we're harvesting certain plant materials, we just hang a drying rack next to our wood stove, and those all work really well. I've used old window screens as drying surfaces propped in the rafters of our upstairs in our house because it gets really stuffy. Flat baskets like this are really amazing. One of my favorite, most space-efficient ways to dry herbs is with these collapsible cloth hanging drying racks. You can buy these online for like $20, and it's actually pretty surprising the amount of plant material you can fit into this. It's useful because it's vertical, so it takes up less space, and then you can collapse it. A really great investment if you want to dry more herbs at home, but you don't want to create the infrastructure to do that. This is a really good alternative. One thing I wanted to talk about is that when I first started growing medicinal herbs, I was really nervous about knowing when they would be dry enough. With herbs, essentially all that you need to do once you're ready to dry them is make sure that you've laid out just a layer of one plant thickness on some sort of screen or wire mesh. You don't want to overstack herbs while you're trying to dry them, because they have so much, a lot of them have so much essential oil in them that if they aren't fully, the weight and the dampness of plant material will cause the plants on the bottom to rot or degrade. So in order to dry well, it needs to be dark, it needs to be warm, there needs to be airflow, and you need to make sure that the plants are just one layer of thickness. And there's a lot of math and like a lot of technology that you can use to assess dryness, but I quickly realized that your hands are the best tool, and you can really just feel when something is dry. It should feel dry to the touch, it should crumble, it should fall apart, it should feel brittle. Literally, once something is dry and crumbly, you can put any sort of a sheet under this to catch the plant material, and you'll put the dried stems and flowers on top of this screen and rub it through the wire mesh. And that's just the fastest way. If you have a small amount of things, you can also just easily strip them by hand. But if you want to grow a lot of something, it might be helpful to have some sort of a screen like this. This is just like wire mesh that we got at the hardware store and then made a frame for, and we just happen to have this random, I don't even know what this is, but I used sawhorses before. It can be pretty makeshift because it's not something you need to use a whole lot. But this is called garbling, when you rub herbs against wire mesh to get the leaves and flowers to fall through the screen, and it keeps the long stems on top, and then you can just compost them. And at the end you'll have this very broken down, very fragrant plant material that's very soft and fluffy, and you can store it then in plastic or in glass. And to store herbs in plastic or glass and keep them out of the dark, sometimes it's nice to have like a dark cupboard that stays closed in your kitchen. Since we grow a lot of plants and we have really big bags and boxes of herbs, we keep them in this funny little crawl space we have under the house that stays cool and dark. Okay, so I'm going to talk about making an herbal vinegar, and we're going to follow the folk method, which is just a 1 to 2 ratio. So 1 part of plant material to 2 parts of whatever you're infusing into. So I'm going to use apple cider vinegar, but you can also infuse into alcohol, into honey, or into any kind of oil. These are all called tinctures, and you take them internally, and they're all a way to preserve and extend the season of your medicine garden. And it's really simple, really straightforward. It's a lot like cooking, where you're just following a particular ratio. So we're gonna use the tulsi that I just harvested in the garden, the holy basil. So this is the plant that is really good for stress. It's an amazing tea, and it tastes really good as a vinegar as well. Like I said, the 1 to 2 ratio is really important, and it's also really important that you compress the plants. I've noticed that when people do this for the first time, they'll kind of lightly fill the jar, and the more plant material you use, the stronger the medicine. And so to get that accurate 1 to 2 ratio, you want to make sure that the jar is half full and really firmly pressed. Once you have this jar, you use your ideally raw and unfiltered apple cider vinegar, because then you also have the mother in here, which is just really great for digestion and health. And then you pour vinegar over the plants. And since we're doing a 1 to 2 ratio and the jar is half full, I'm just going to go all the way to the top. And that's it. What I do after that, if it's a vinegar, it's really important because the vinegar is corrosive to the metal banding that I use as the lids for mason jars. So it's really important to lay Ideally plastic or waxed paper can work, but not quite as well. But to put a barrier between the vinegar and the metal. Otherwise the metal will get really rusty and it will affect the taste of the tincture. And then you really want to shake the jar to make sure that the vinegar goes all the way to the bottom and the plants are fully incorporated into the jar. And then I'll check to see if that shaking has lowered the level of the vinegar at all, which it has. So really the only thing that you need to worry about when making a tincture, whether it's with oil or honey or alcohol or vinegar, is to make sure that the plants are fully submerged by whatever menstruum you're using. So menstruum is a fancy word that just means the extractant that you're using to cover the plants. Oil, alcohol, vinegar, honey, those are all preservatives, and I feel really confident that any tincture you make with any of those preservatives will last for a really long time. And once you have this tincture, you should let it sit for at least 2 weeks, ideally longer. The longer the better. This is again something that once you've prepared it, you want to keep it somewhere cool and dark. So this is also something that shouldn't be exposed to sunlight. Vinegar is an amazing extractant. The raw vinegar has a lot of health benefits and it extracts the taste and the medicinal quality of the plant really well. Alcohol is a stronger extractant. It's just more dehydrating, and so that's another really great option for making tinctures. If you do that, you need to use a high proof alcohol. What I use is a really high proof organic cane alcohol that is way too strong for my taste, so I'll actually dilute 50% water and 50% high proof alcohol. And that's also because different materials will extract different chemicals. So there's some plant chemicals that are oil soluble, some that are water soluble, some that are soluble by vinegar or alcohol. So I like to dilute the taste of the alcohol while knowing that the water is also extracting additional qualities. So this is a fresh tincture, 1:2 ratio, usually no stems, leaf, flower, root of plants. And this is something that you'll keep infusing for at least 2 weeks, ideally longer, and ultimately you'll strain this. You can also make a dry tincture, and that's a different ratio because the water is gone from the plant material, so it has much less volume and much less weight, so you need to accommodate accordingly. The general rule of thumb is that you would use 1/4 of the dried plant material that you would fresh. So it's a little more math, but it's still all fractional and pretty simple. So for example, in this jar, I used essentially 4 cups of fresh tulsi to half fill this 8-cup mason jar. If I was using dried tulsi, I would just use 1 cup of dried tulsi. So it seems like you're using a lot less plant material, but the dry plant material is a lot more concentrated. So you're making an equally strong extractant. And I also wanted to show you what the dry plant material looks like. And this is an herb where if I opened the bag, I would still get a really strong smell of the plant that this is, which is gotu-kola. And that would tell me right away that this is still really strong and powerful medicine, and it's great to use for a dry tincture. Again, following that ratio of 1/4 part to what I would be using as a fresh herb. So once you've let your tincture sit, after a day or 2, you can stop checking to make sure that the plants are fully covered by the liquid, because at that point everything should have settled and it should be stable. But I always try to check at least once or twice after I've made a tincture in the first few days to make sure the plants are totally under the level of the extractant. This is a vinegar that's been sitting for exactly a month. And you'll notice that the color is really different. And that's because the brightness of the plants has infused into the vinegar. And if I opened this jar I would smell the plants in the vinegar really strongly. To strain tinctures, which ultimately is what you can do to just make them more available to you, our method is really simple. A funnel that can fit into a mason jar, and at least 2 layers of unbleached cheesecloth. So on a bigger scale, a really big farm would probably have a tincture press, which is this pneumatic contraption that will really squeeze every last drop of vinegar out of the plants. We do that by hand with our cheesecloth. So we'll pour this jar of plants that have infused for a month now through the cheesecloth. All the vinegar goes into a jar below this one, and the plants stay above, and then we'll gather up the cheesecloth and strain it as tightly as we can with our hands. And that's because a lot of the strongest vinegar is what's in the plants, and so you want to make sure to really compress that plant material. By the time that you're done, it should be kind of dry, and then you can just compost that and return it to your garden. Once you have a jar of strained vinegar or alcohol or honey, we usually use them by pouring them into smaller tincture bottles. So this is a 1 ounce bottle. These are pretty easy to find online, and they come with a dropper. And this is just a really simple, easy way to take medicine. And you just depress the bulb, and naturally you'll get about a half dropper's worth of the vinegar, and that's a great dose. A half dropper once a day to twice a day is a really good dose for an herbal medicine. My favorite way to take herbal medicine is just to drink tea. It's the easiest way to have plants in your life every day, and especially if you have them fresh in your garden and you can just make a fresh tea every day. It's so easy and delicious. It's a little different from brewing tea with tea bags, because to make a strongly medicinal dose of an infusion, which is another word for tea, you need to let the plants sit in warm water for quite a while. So there's a few ways to accomplish this. You can either simmer, for a lot of roots especially, I like to simmer on the stovetop in water for at least 30 minutes to an hour, really, really, really low simmer with a lid over the pot, and that creates this really strong smelling medicinal tea.